So the class is being recorded, and this is me again, Dr. Sama, and this is the post-MTA period. We're marching towards the end of the semester. We have done the MTA. The MTA is the midterm exam, and what is ahead is less if you compare it to what we have been doing. We're doing poetry this time around, and perhaps next time, and then we move on. I don't know whether I need to still check the calendar. I don't know whether what this fantastic novel is with us or not. This romantic novel, Frankenstein, is with us, and I need to check calendar. I think I was told at one point at the start of this, I need to update myself and perhaps get back to you about whether Frankenstein is with us this semester around or not. Anyway, we're doing poetry this time around. And obviously poetry is a totally different genre. We're used to plays because we did 2 plays already. We're used to novellas because we did Candide, which was a novella. And this time around, we have a different genre and also a time or a different time period with plays. We did 16th and the 17th century. We did Shakespeare and Webster. And then we moved on to the 18th century when we did Candide by Voltaire. And this time around, we're talking about the late 18th century and the early 19th century. This is where and when the Romantics are up and running. We'll talk about the Romantics and who the Romantics are and what they did and what they didn't. And we're going to have representative works from their output. Perhaps I need to make this distinction between romantic in the folkloric or perhaps the pop cultural sense, and romantic in its special way. And obviously, when we talk about literature, the word romantic would have different associations than when we meet it or we use it in daily life. So Romanticism here in the course is not about people falling in love with each other and perhaps eventually getting married and living happily ever after. This is not the Romanticism or the romance that we mean here. By Romanticism, by romantic, by romance, in a literary movement. And obviously, when I say it's a literary movement, then obviously I am narrowing the scope because it's an artistic and a literary and also intellectual and philosophical movement that started in late 18th century and we took perhaps until half of the 19th century. The remnants of it were perhaps half the 19th century. Those were a group of talents. They can be philosophers because we have romantic philosophy. They can be writers. We have romantic novels and novelists. Can be romantic poets because we have romantic poets. And they did daring things. They were engaged in setting the record straight, if you like. They were not happy about how things ran on the political level, on social level, on the intellectual level, and they wanted a change. So each of them, using his unique talent, started to effect this change. If the talent is literature, they write poetry, they reflect those changes that they hope for in their poetry. If they happen to be philosophers, they reflect those changes in their philosophies. If they were artistic in any ways, sculpture or painting, they reflect that in their field of expertise or talent. So Romanticism across the genres and across the fields is about revolutionizing things, championing new ways of dealing with reality, challenging old established concepts. So a poetry is written in a certain way. A poetry is about rigidity and sticking to rhyme schemes, having certain rhythms, perhaps mirroring nature. They say no. Romantic poets wouldn't do it this way. They are going to write poetry that is free, free in terms of themes and ideas, and also free in terms or free from the rigidity of old poetry, in the poetry of the Augustan age before them, where imitating nature would be the ultimate goal. No, romantics came and say no, we're not into that. Poetry before us is very rigid, is very artificial, and we're not playing this game. We're going to start our own um, poetry, poetry that is free from rigidity, poetry that is liberating itself from the restrictions of rhyme and rhythm, poetry that addresses nature. And nature, by nature, they mean outside nature. They mean the countryside, they mean perhaps the desert, whatever is untouched, whatever is or whatever remains unmolested by the corrupt hands of the human being. They have this idea that whatever human beings put their hands to, they corrupt, they mess with and change to the worse, of course. So they came and say the only places where the corrupt hands of human beings haven't been there yet is outside nature, the nature of the countryside, the desert, perhaps. But of course, they didn't have deserts, and I'm giving you an example from our local environment. So whatever is unmolested and untouched by the human being, they glorify. That's why they glorify nature, capital N. And whoever live by nature, and who live by nature, of course, it's the farmers. So nature here and elsewhere is in the countryside where you have rivers, you have mountains, you have beautiful scenery. And who live there, who live in the countryside? It's the farmers. And the farmers of the past were simple people. They were not educated. They were perhaps naive, very simple. They don't have the crookedness and the calculations of people in the cities, city dwellers. City dwellers are normally sophisticated. They calculate everything. They are, according to people like Wordsworth, are artificial and not very pure or innocent. On the contrary, people in the countryside, because they live by nature and in nature, they learned a great deal from nature. They take their purity and innocence from outside nature. So most of the poetry of the Romantics, as you're going to see, is set in nature, is about nature, and is about nature dwellers, the people of the countryside. So this is what we're going to be talking about all the time. We're going to talk about the Romantics, and we're going to focus more on, uh, you know, literary Romantics. We're not going to address ourselves to um, perhaps political Romanticism or philosophical Romanticism or even artistic uh, um, Romanticism. The focus is on literary Romanticism and the literary Romantics, whether they are poets or novelists, because we're English major and we're English literature major. But there is going to be a great deal of overlap between literary romantics, political romantics, philosophical romantics, because they are all, or their point of departure is revolution. Revolution politically and also on the level of forms and ways of expression. Okay, so it's the romantic poets that we're dealing with, and it's obviously romantic poetry is all over Europe. You have romantic poets in Germany, you have romantic poets in France, and in other segments and parts of Europe. Again, because this is English literature, we're focused on English romantic poets. In this sense, you would have people like William Wordsworth, perhaps one of the fathers and pioneers of Romanticism, would have people like Coleridge, another pioneering figure. You have people like Shelley and Keats. This is if we're talking about poetry. If we talk about novels, we have Mary Shelley, the writer of Frankenstein, for example. Uh, so these are the people that we're going to address ourselves to. The focus is going to be perhaps more on Wordsworth. We're going to have a whole chapter in the textbook on Wordsworth and his different poems and his different uh, stages of development. When we talk about the Romantics, we talk about two generations. We have first generation poets and we have second generation poets. The first wave of Romanticism would include people like Wordsworth, Coleridge. A little earlier to them was William Blake, who is a romantic, and sometimes we call him or refer to him as pre-romantic. And then we have the second generation group of poets, people like Lord Byron, people like John Keats, Shelley, and those were perhaps more politically oriented. They had so many political messages to get across to people. We're focused again on the first generation of poets, and we'll have those comparisons always between people like Wordsworth and uh, William Blake, for example. Okay, so let's perhaps focus more on the characteristics of romantic poetry. Again, romantic poetry is not a poetry of love and romance. It's the word romantic here means whatever is wild, whatever is strange, whatever is out of the ordinary. And obviously, out of the ordinary in a positive way. When we talk about nature, this is out of the ordinary because you would compare nature to the city, and obviously, the city and the town is more familiar to people. So when you have people talk about outside nature, the nature of the countryside, this is obviously out of the ordinary. When you have people focusing exclusively and entirely on the imagination, okay, this is obviously uh, out of the ordinary. When you have people focusing on emotions and the feelings of the poet, and this is obviously new, this is also out of the ordinary. When you have people focusing on the sublime, and by the sublime I mean whatever sometimes gives you the creeps, whatever you can be fearful of, but you like. How? I don't know. This is out of the ordinary, and this is what we're going to take for the element of the sublime. Look at yourself, for example. We have people here with us who love horror movies, in spite of the fact that horror movies make their hair stand on end. It can be very scary, and they love it. So you have this contradiction. You have people climbing up mountains, and those mountains are very high, obviously, and very tall. And when they look from there, obviously, it's very scary, but they like it. They like whatever happens inside them. The adrenaline levels soar and stuff. This is the supply. It's this idea of the contradiction that we have in us that the romantics also address. This is out of the ordinary, I promise you. So, again, when we talk about the romantics now, we talk about these mm, out of the ordinary things. So, what are some of their features and characteristics? I'm trying to say that if I have a poem, because we're dealing with poems, how can I identify its romanticism or romanticness, if you like? What makes it romantically recognizable? When I see it, I say this is a romantic poem. Is it because it has a love interest, people falling in love? No, this is not what we mean by romanticism by now, right? When I see glorification of nature, people celebrating outside nature, talking about the countryside. The countryside is not only a background, it is perhaps, or they have very active role in what happens. When you see poems where we call them free verse or free poems, where the writer is not following the rhythmic and the metrical guidelines of old poets. You don't have fixed rhyme. You don't have rhythm. I mean, the music of the poem is internal. Uh, the imagery are all addressing our different senses. Obviously, this is romantic. When you have flights of the imagination in the poem, when you have reference to Greek mythology and other mythologies, I mean, Eastern mythology. This is also romantic. Um, so these are some of the features that I would like you to be on the lookout about every time we have a poem. You need to decide for yourself whether this is a romantic or a non-romantic poem. And I think I have examples of that. But perhaps before we do that, let's ask a more foundational question about what a poem is and what distinguishes a poem from a non-poem, if you like. So if we have examples and models of different genres, a model representing novels and model representing plays and a model representing poems. How can you distinguish and say which is which? What is so unique and so peculiar about a poem? What makes you believe that a poem is a poem? From afar, we're not talking about the subject matter yet. Why? Because whatever I can say in a poem, I can also say in a novel, I can also say in a play. So obviously, the subject matter is not what distinguishes a poem from a non-poem. It's something else. Okay? Let's have Nagwa on board. Okay. Nagwa.
Yeah, one of the main things that might be clear for us to distinguish between a poem and other literary works is its structure. Unlike the other literary works or academic writings, poems are structured in lines or stanzas and not paragraphs.
Yeah, you mean this is, I mean, stay away from jargon for a minute. Don't tell me stanzas
Oh,
because I don't know what a stanza is, yani, at least for now. When you see a poem from afar and you see a piece of a novel from afar, graphically, when you see it, what distinguishes the poem or piece of poem that you have in front of your eyes?
Poems are usually shorter and they consist of multiple lines.
Okay, I agree that they are shorter. Okay, but what do you mean by they consist of multiple lines? Because novels also consist of multiple lines, right?
Yeah, yeah, the arrangement. It's just I don't know how to
Mm,
convey my point. It's the
mm,
arrangement.
mm.
It's unlike that of like other
Let,
writings.
let me make it perhaps easier. This is what you're trying to say, but for some reason, that's not very clear. Um, in terms of where the words are on the line. And I'll give you choices until you tell me which is which. If you have a line that starts on one of the margins and it ends on the other margin, is this a poem? And they are all consistent in terms of length. Is this a poem? Is this your concept of a poem? Line to line, I mean, margin to margin lines. Mm.
Wouldn't say yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't say yes either. So when you have this line, margin to margin kind of thing, and it moves from left to right, and it's um, a long line that gets repeated, and it's very consistent. This is obviously a piece of prose. It can be a novel, it can be a short story, right? But with poems, the lines are shorter, way shorter. They don't start on one margin and they end on the other margin, right? They are shorter and they are not consistent. Some of them are long, right? And some of them are short. I mean, you don't have consistency when it comes. That's why sometimes you have poems that would look like a triangle where the base is on top, and then they they start to be smaller, and right. Okay, so this is a distinguishing feature, the fact that you don't have this margin to margin lines in a poem. What else is very distinguishable and distinguishing about a poem? So characteristic of a poem, together with this short, shorter lines, inconsistent lines, if you like. Which is more, or which has music, poems or novels and plays, or what? What do you think? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Nicole.
Poems are distinguished for their rhythmic features. They are usually divided into meters and rhymes to give it, as you've mentioned, a musical feature or a musical characteristic, which
Yes,
is enjoyable to hear.
yes. That's why I mean, sometimes, not sometimes, most of the time, you have songs, right? We listen to songs every day. Songs are originally what? When you introduce the writer of a song, what do we say about him or her? Do we say the writer or the poet? Because they are poets, make no mistake about it. كالشاعر الغنائي, such and such, right? The poet فلان wrote this song, right? ولا إيه؟ مش right?
Yes.
Okay. So songs are poems, and they are, when you see them written, they are not very long, like we have said. They're not very long in terms of horizontally, I mean. And they also rhyme, and they also have meter or rhythm. So music is key when it comes to poems. If you don't have this uh, feel of music, it's not a poem, right? Well, that's why it's easy for you to memorize lines from a poem than lines in a novel, because novels are in prose, method. They don't have rhyme or rhythm. That's why I mean, you fail to memorize them. But poems are memorizable because of the rhythm and the rhyme. Okay, and where is the rhyme in a poem? How can you detect the rhyme in a poem? Of course, the music is something that you hear in your ears, but also it is graphically somewhere in a poem. Where is the rhyme in a poem? يعني مش عارف ليه Najwa is the only one who is reacting as if we were born yesterday, as if we haven't heard or read poetry in our lives. Some of us may even be poets, and they don't know, or they don't want to know, or they don't want us to know. Let me stop and ask you: do you write poetry? The language is obviously irrelevant. It can be Arabic, English, whatever language, whatever your mother tongue is. Do you write poetry? Do you catch yourself writing poetry sometimes? Raise your hand. Writing poetry is not a sin against the Holy Spirit, I promise you. Shaden, yeah, go ahead.
I wouldn't call it poetry.
We call it poetry.
It's just
Mm.
rhyming.
Rhyming. You write things that are rhymed. Why are
Yeah.
you perhaps harsh on yourself? Why don't you recognize them as poetry?
Because I don't think there is a deep meaning behind it.
Yeah, we're always harsh on ourselves. I mean, let other people judge, yeah, Shaden. Okay, so you write in Arabic or in English? You,
Both.
yeah, that's nice. And you have like a diwan or something, a volume of poetry that you can
No,
share
no.
with us? I mean,
Amateur,
individual.
amateur.
Hmm. And you're not sharing this with anyone?
No, it's just, I call it just scribbles almost.
You mean you do what with it?
Like, I never sit down and
Ah,
just do a full
mm-hmm.
verse per se.
It's like flashes that comes and you note them
Yes.
down and
One
that reveal.
liners. Yes.
That's interesting too. Who else? Yeah, who else writes poetry? Arabic, English? No one? Okay. Who appreciates poetry? Appreciates means that you like to hear or read poetry. Okay. Nagwa does. Who else? Okay, so if you Shaden does. Okay. Okay. So Nagwa, you said that you appreciate poetry, you like poetry, right?
Yes, I really enjoy those poems that like have very good rhyming and like they have a music, yeah, like the music in them. I really enjoy when I read it, and also like I find some of the elements of literature like similes and metaphor very intriguing. I sometimes just sit and think about how did the poet come up with this idea to compare or to give this imaginary thing.
Yeah, yeah, that's the genius of po, I mean poets. I mean the fact that um, they kind of unite whatever is ununitable, if you like. I mean, they thrive in contradiction and pulling together opposites, and they are just amazing in how sudden and strange they are in their in the way they use I mean idioms, and by idioms here I mean the language itself, manipulating the language in a certain way. Jaden, you said that you also appreciate poetry. What kind of poetry are you into?
Maybe philosophical.
What did you say?
Philosophical.
Philosophical
Like
poetry.
existential dread.
Ex- oh, existential. That's big, Yashid. Okay. I like philosophical poetry, and let me tell you this. It's a quote that I heard or I wrote, I mean, I read somewhere, and I totally believe in it, that poetry is very intellectual. It's also hard, and it's not for the faint-hearted, if you like. It's very sophisticated, and you need to be you need to be, you know, the process of reading a poem or hearing a poem is um, very, you have to kind of be very attentive and very alert, because it's at its minimum, poetry is philosophical. Um, and this is perhaps one reason why it's not, poetry is not up for grabs, and it's not it doesn't lend itself to easy interpretation. You need to take it very seriously. Again, it can be about enjoyment and entertainment, but there is obviously more to poetry than just that. Make no mistake about it. So what is the latest? I mean, let me ask Shaden. Do you remember when you last read a poem, and what was it?
Yes. Sylvia Plath, The Applicant,
Okay.
is the
That's it.
last one.
Yeah. Of course, you know how she died, right? Very
Yes, of
philosophical
course.
kind of death.
Yes.
You know? I mean, killing yourself is very philosophical, mind you, right? Uh, Sylvia Plath happens to be, enigmatic and philosophical and everything in between. Okay, let me ask Nagwa about the last or the latest poem, the poem that you read recently. Nagwa. Have you read anything
Uh, yes, the
recently?
last poem I have read was Martian Sends a Postcard to Home, Postcard Home, something like that.
Nice.
Yeah, it was very interesting, and the descriptions were like very intriguing.
Yeah, this is perhaps the beauty of it all. I mean, the
Yeah,
fact that it
exactly.
doesn't lend itself to easy interpretation, like very philosophical, like Shadid is saying. And this is very beautiful because it engages your different senses and you add to the senses the sense of, I mean, it addresses the intellect in you, right? It's like a puzzle, but a nice one. Puzzle meant to stimulate your senses, your intellect, your imagination, and everything. Okay, interesting to know. Let's go back to the Romantics. And now that we're done with the idea of what poetry is and how we can recognize a poem uh, on 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 the page or when we hear one. Of course, together with the rhyme and the rhythm, you also have this idea of length in terms horizontally. In terms of themes and ideas, like I said, whatever you can express in poetry, you can express in other genres like novels and plays. But perhaps whatever you express in a novel of 200 or 300 or perhaps more pages, you express only in a stanza, in a group of lines. Can be 4, 5, 6, 14 if it's a sonnet, right? So if you talk about war, it would take the poet a poem, a few lines to express what war is and what war brings in terms of destruction and catastrophes. The same thing can be expressed in a whole novel that is perhaps 300 words long or more, right? So this is the beauty of poetry. This idea of intensity and condensation, the fact that it's so condensed. And this is also, that would also point to the genius of the poet. If a poet spends a few lines or invests in a few lines in order to convince you of the of how war is bad and destructive and everything, in a few lines, when other people in other genres would spend hundreds of pages doing that, this is genius. This is success, right? Okay. Um, so like I said, you can almost recognize a poem from afar from the layout, how it is written on the page, right? Let me see if I have examples of just that. Okay. Look at this. Can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah, from afar. Would you consider this poetry? This from afar. Don't read it. I don't want you to read. Just tell me. Is this poetry? From afar.
No.
No, it's not poetry, right? And when you read it, uh, uh, I mean, this impression is going to be reinforced. It's not a poem. This is prose, right? So these are definitions, and we don't write definitions in poetry, right? How about this? Do you think this is a poem from afar?
No.
No, it's not. Absolutely not. How about this? From afar.
Yes.
Hmm?
Yes.
It's a poem, right? From afar. So you don't have this margin to margin lines. They are not, they may start at a certain margin, but they don't end there, right? You also have, or it's not consistent. One line is long and the other is short, right? And they are not consistent in how long or how short they are. This is from afar, right? How about this one? You think this is a poem?
Yes.
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 Yeah, it is. How about this one?
Yes.
Yeah, it is, right? How about this one?
Yes.
Yeah, it is a poem. Okay. And of course, when you start reading, you or hearing, obviously, because poetry is meant to be heard, right? You start to be on the lookout about the music, the rhythm, and the rhyme, the imagery, right? Okay. Uh, I'm not going to talk much about that because it's when I mean poetry should be practiced, felt, and appreciated, not read about. You don't read about poetry, but you live the experience of hearing a poem or reading a poem. So perhaps I would like you to tell me whether you agree with those statements or not. When I say, for example, that poetry captures our mood, it conveys our feelings and communicates a message by using rhythm, sound, and imagery. Do you agree with this definition?
Yes, I do.
Yes. Captures our mood, it conveys our feelings, and communicates messages. And in order to do all of that, poetry uses rhythm, sound, and imagery, right? Okay, so in order to do that, a poet uses or has at his disposal a number of things. He has diction, he has sound choices, he has imagery, he has figurative language. And of course, he uses speakers. Speakers means that you can have the poet himself, the persona of the persona of the poet. What do I mean by diction? I mean words, vocabulary. That is obviously different from the everyday vocabulary. For the most part, the vocabulary and the diction of poetry is different. Unless it's the romantics, because the romantics try to use the language of everyday. They don't have poetic diction anymore. Again, why do I use certain diction and certain sounds and imagery? What's the purpose? I'm trying to create meaning. So poetry is also about meaning, mind you. You don't focus on the formal aspects at full stop. You don't focus on determining the rhythm or the rhyme, the imagery, and you stop there. You need to put them together and come up with the totality of experience would refer you to the effect that the poet is trying to reach or arrive at, which is obviously, it can be an effect that he is trying to create. It can be a message that he is trying to get across to us. Okay, so poetry is about speakers, about sounds, images, figurative language, and poetic diction. The language, the poems. Okay, when we talk about sound, we talk about what we call alliteration. Alliteration would be the repetition of the first sound in a number of repetitive of words. When I say whither will thou wander wayfarer, so wa. This is called repetition because it comes at the start of the word. And then you have assonance, which means the similarity of two or more vowel sounds. Onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is when you have a word, when you mention the word, you can understand the meaning. The meaning, the sound, and the meaning are, they reveal each other. When I say buzz, you know that you're pressing something, hiss. And then you have rhyme. We spoke about rhymes and where rhymes are, a similarity in the sound of word endings. And rhythm, when I talk about meter, the pattern formed by stressed and unstressed syllables. Speak about metaphors. Um, Obviously, you're describing somebody or something using a word or phrase that is not meant literally. When I talk about what, when I say that one of those very famous metaphors would be describing, for example, Jesus Christ as a lamb. Obviously, the meaning is clear. We're talking about meekness, about niceness, gentleness, uh, uh, compassion. When when I say that somebody is a lion, obviously the meaning is clear. I'm talking about how he is valiant and courageous. Um, and then similes, and similes are also like metaphors, except for the fact that it is very explicit, where you use like or as with it. And then personification, which is also a variation on metaphors, except for the fact that part of the metaphor is liking something to a human being or liking a human being to something. Like I said, poems are not created in a vacuum. They are not um they are not empty in terms of meaning. They give us meaning and a profound kind of meaning. So the idea of focusing entirely and exclusively on the formal aspects and forgetting about meaning is not very is not very good. You still need to think of the meaning. And again, in order to arrive at a meaning or an effect in a poem, you need to put all the elements that we spoke about together: vocabulary, imagery, figures of speech, figurative language, and all those kinds of things. And these are poems. Like I said, I'm not going to go into details about them. Let's move on. And this is an introduction that we have already started about the Romantics and their evolution and development. So it's the Romantics and Romanticism that we're talking about. Again, to limit the Romantics and Romanticism to literature would be doing the Romantics a disservice, because there is more to the Romantics than just literature and poetry. You have Romantics and Romanticism in painting, in music, in architecture, philosophy, and so on. Again, we're talking about the late 18th century and the early till the mid 19th century. So, what did or what were the Romantics up against? They were against the principles of order, calm, harmony, balance, uh, and rationality. So they were against the ideals of the Enlightenment. They said that life is not like that. Life is not about balance. Rationalizing everything is not always good, and the outcomes and the results were not as pleasing as people make us believe. Harmony, calm, order, these are things that do not really exist according to them. So they rejected these things and they said these are artificial and then they don't truly reflect reality. So it was a reaction against the Enlightenment and against 18th century rationalism and materialism. What they focused instead, what they focused on instead was the individual, the subjective, the irrational, the imaginative, the personal, the spontaneous, the emotional, the visionary, and the transcendental. So these are ideas and feelings and senses that are sometimes difficult to detect and trace unless you're truly into them. This is what you're after, they are after. They're not after whatever is materialistic, whatever is rational and reasonable. They said, and obviously this is what they said. I mean, look at where we went with those ideas. If you talk about rationality, if you talk about reason, if you talk about balance and harmony, and you have still have wars and people killing each other, it's the same polemic, it's the same rationale that was put forward by Voltaire, and you still remember Voltaire. Voltaire was also against these ideas, the ideas of the Enlightenment, because it didn't think about peace and harmony. Instead, it brought about wars and disasters. So they are quite in line with what Voltaire was saying during his time. Except for the fact that they provided solutions. Remember, Voltaire was giving us ideas, but he didn't impose his opinion. What the Romantics did is that they gave us alternatives. Instead of the rigidity of rhyme and rhythm, we would write poetry that is free of all of that. And instead of focusing on the city, we're going to go all the way to the countryside. Instead of focusing on outside reality, we're going to focus on the emotions and the feelings of the poet and his people, the people that he writes about. We're going to also be spontaneous. And we're going to also be visionary about the future. We're going to also be transcendental, talking about issues beyond the immediate, beyond the here and the now. So this is the Romantics, and like I said, we have this deep appreciation for the beauties of nature. They have this preference of emotion over reason. They have this preference of the senses over the intellect. Uh, and the idea of genius. I mean, they always think of themselves and their protagonists as heroes, as exceptional figures, and that's why they dig deep into history and they come up with, you know, the characters of the rebel, the misfit, uh, the downtrodden sometimes. Uh, uh, for them, yeah, look for example at the character of Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. This is a highly romantic figure, right? So when they think of life, when they have to compare between living in the city and living in the countryside, they would focus on the city, on the jungle, the forest, the desert. They believe that the garden is human made. That's why it's artificial, and they are against artificiality. So if they have to choose between the garden and the jungle, they would go for the jungle because the jungle is untrimmed, is untouched by human beings and their corrupting hands. According to them, the artist or the poet is a visionary, is is a supreme individual who has a free and a creative spirit. So if the poet is creative and is a free spirit, you wouldn't overwhelm him or her with strict adherence to formal rules and traditional procedures. Again, the imagination is key, and it is their gateway to transcendent experience and spiritual truth. They thrive in studying and in reproducing folk culture, national and ethnic cultural origins, and the medieval period. Again, they like whatever is exotic, whatever is remote, whatever is monstrous, and even whatever is satanic. Again, we said that we have two movements. The first movement would start with the publication of the lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And a little earlier, we had William Blake, who was, a pre-romantic, and after the lyrical ballads, and after William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, you have a second generation that would compromise people like Lord Byron, Shelley, Keats, and others. Okay, we're going to stop on this note and we're going to take a 10-minute break. And then when we come back, we talk more about the romantics. Until then, wish you all the best. Let's meet in 10 minutes, inshallah. Bye bye. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I am back. Can you hear me? Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
Hello.
doctor.
Yeah, clear, huh? طيب.
Yes.
Yeah. So remember, it's the romantics that we're highlighting and talking about today, and we're not likely, of course, to finish today. I mean, it's a vast terrain, if you like, where we have lots of territory. Um, okay. Hi. It's the romantics that we're doing, and it's Wordsworth to be more specific. Wordsworth happens to be one of the pioneers of the Romantic movement. And the chapter that we're doing on him is called A Poet in a Landscape. And the title is very telling. It tells you a great deal um, about what is ahead. Let me share this with you. Okay, so chapter 1, William Wordsworth, Poet or a Poet in a Landscape. So Wordsworth, or William Wordsworth, we know by now. We have established the fact that this guy is a pioneer in the Romantic movement, and um, there is still a lot that we're going to cover about it. And then we say poet in a landscape. He's a poet, and of course, you know what the associations of a poet is by now, or are by now, and in a landscape. And obviously, when I talk about landscape, and we even use it now, right? A lot. When we talk about landscape, obviously we're talking about nature. And what kind of nature? We talk about the nature of the countryside. It's not artificial nature. It's not the gardens that we see all over the place in cities. No, this is trimmed. This is man-made and artificial. No, not pure. What Wordsworth and other Romantic poets have in mind is the nature of the countryside. Again, for its obvious associations. When we talk about the countryside, we talk about mountains, we talk about landscapes, we talk about lakes and rivers, talk about perhaps wild animals, and they all contribute towards this effect of serenity, purity, innocence, and innocence, obviously. So this is what Wordsworth, uh, finds solace in. He loves it when he is one with nature. Again, this is perhaps one big reason why he decides, perhaps towards the end of his life or a little earlier, to leave the city behind and go to the countryside. There were also political reasons. Was After the failure of the French Revolution, he was hunted and haunted by the government for his views, radical as they were. So, but obviously, when he went to the countryside, he went there in order to live in nature because he loves nature. So, a poet in a landscape. So, again, the landscape would be nature, would be the countryside, where life is simple, pure, unmolested by the corrupt hands of human beings. Um, Dove Cottage is where he resided when he decided to go and live um, in nature in the countryside. Again, it's a landmark and a tourist attraction. Everybody goes there when they visit Britain in order to kind of reconstruct the poetic experience of the, because there is this trend in literary scholarship and in poetry that you stand to gain more knowledge and more sensations when you go and visit the places where a poet used to frequent, where a poet used to live and do stuff. So that's why they have now a museum named, of course, after Wordsworth, and people go there and try to relive the experiences that Wordsworth went through while writing poetry. So as you can see, this is the countryside. And if you look at it, you're going to see how pure it is, how um, um, you know, it looks very simple, of course, and very scenic, very beautiful scenery. And obviously, you don't have human beings, you don't have tall buildings, you don't have traffic. It's pure nature. And this is
Dr.
about right.
Sameh,
Yeah, go ahead.
I apologize for interrupting. There's
That's
no slides showing.
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is what I was talking about. See, this is outside nature. This is where Wordsworth used to live, you know, towards the end of his life. Again, we have a problem, or perhaps he has a problem. I'm talking about Wordsworth. He has this, fear and phobia that when he moves to the countryside and go and live in one of the villages, he will not be accepted by the people. People would look at him as an outsider because he's not originally from there. So he gives the expression to those fears in more than one poem, and we'll talk about that. And we will have poems expressing those fears and anxieties that he doesn't belong. Spoke about poems and their formal aspects. Spoke about rhythm, diction, voice, rhyme, and all those kinds. And this is the first poem that we're dealing with as far as Wordsworth is concerned. It's I wandered lonely as a cloud over the daffodils. And I'm sure some of you may have done it back at school, or perhaps you're doing it as teachers now. So I wandered lonely as a cloud. Does it ring any bells? Hmm. Okay, Nagwa, go ahead.
Yes, it is one of the poems that like one of the early poems that I've studied when I was back in school, maybe 6, 7 years ago, something like that. I remember that its main topic was about a field of daffodils,
Wait, wait,
and
wait,
the
wait,
po
wait, wait,
okay,
wait, wait. Okay. So you know the poem. That's more than enough. Thank you.
yeah.
Anybody else? The daffodils. I wandered lonely as a cloud. Okay. Yeah, it's good and bad. It's bad that you don't know it, but it's good that you don't know it so that we can kind of, unpack it together. and perhaps implement and apply what we said about poems and what poems are, their different aspects and facets and everything in between. Um, okay, so this is the poem, and I'm not going to spoil it for you. Nagwa tried to spoil it for us, but I stopped her. Well, let's read it and see what it is all about. I would like you to ask yourself a number of questions. One of them would be whether you think this is truly a poem, or I'm perhaps misleading you by saying that it is a poem. Perhaps you think that it is not a poem. You would go back to what I said about what is distinguishable and characteristic of a poem. And then, if it's a poem, what kind of poem is it? Do you think it's a romantic poem? Again, you would refer back to what I said about what romantic poems are, and then come back to me. I'll give you 5 long minutes to establish whether this is a poem, first of all, and second of all, whether it is a romantic poem or not. And obviously, you need to come up with reasons as why it is a poem and why it is a romantic poem. Okay, yalla. You guys have 5 long minutes to read and tell me. Yalla, go ahead. Okay, can you talk about them? About it? Okay, can I see hands up? Remember those two questions I asked you? You think it's a poem? And if you think it's a poem, why you think it's a poem? This is number one. And then if we have established the fact that it's a poem, what kind of poem, whether it's romantic or non-romantic, and again, you provide reasons. So I don't know where everybody else. And obviously, I fail to engage other people, and I know it's my problem, and I need to work on that. But can you try? I mean, other people. So my big question is whether this is a poem or not, and for and why if you think it's a poem. Yeah, go ahead, yeah, Najwa.
Yes, from what we've discussed and the orientation that is shown, we can indicate that this is a poem. It does not follow what we've said, the margins. It does not start from one margin and then in the other. And the length of the lines vary. Some are shorter, slightly shorter than the other, some are longer, and so on. And we can already see that also it is a poem through the use of literary elements such as the alliteration and similes that are found in the poem.
Do we have music? Did you feel the music?
Yes, of course, we have. There is a rhyme scheme and there is a rhythm in the poem.
Okay. A good test in order to test whether a poem is a poem would be to read it out loud. And if you hear the music, that means that, yeah, it's of course a successful poem. It's a poem first of all, and it is a successful. Okay, thank you. So it's a poem, everyone. And let's move to the second question on whether it is a romantic poem or not. And of course, we need to say why it is this or that. Let's have Shaden because she was raising her hand.
Yes, I think it's romantic.
Yeah. Why? Why do you think it's a romantic poem?
He talks about nature
Nice.
and his connection to nature.
Yeah, and different elements of nature.
Yes,
And
and like
obviously,
it
yeah,
brings him joy, and
yeah,
there's imagery that makes you feel a connection
yeah,
to nature.
yeah, great. Yeah, that's what I wanted to hear. Thank you so much, Shaden. Let's go back to Najwa because she was raising her hand. Najwa, do you want to perhaps add to what Shaden is saying about the poem being romantic?
Yes, I would just say just what Jaden said, that there is nature, which is one of the important elements or indications that this is a romantic poet, and also that we can feel or sense the poet's emotion or the narrator's emotions throughout the poem when he first was sad and then his emotions develop. And also we can sense or we can feel the imagination because at the end of the poem, the narrator or the poet is reminiscing. So this gives us a sense of an imagination that he is imagining the field of daffodil or the scenery that he was impressed with.
Okay. Remember one distinguishing feature between romantic poetry and non-romantic poetry would be the idea of simplicity of diction. If the words are simple, the lines are shorter. Did you feel that? Did you feel that the words he is using are words that we're likely to use in our everyday encounters and conversations?
Yes,
Because this is a test of the romanticity of the poem, if you like. Okay. So It's The Daffodils, or I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. It's a lovely poem, and it's highly romantic for what we said and what we have seen. Uh, I mean, even the title is very suggestive. I wandered lonely as a cloud. So this is obviously the poet himself or the persona of the poem, wandered. So, and obviously, in order to wander means to move around. You need space. Obviously, you don't wander around in big, crowded cities like Jeddah, for example, or perhaps Riyadh, where it's crowded and busy, right? There is no room for you to wander um, unfettered because you may have traffic here and there. But if you are in nature, and this is obviously an indication that he is in a free, open space, which is obviously nature and something that only nature, the countryside, can afford you. I wandered lonely um, as a cloud, lonely. And this is perhaps something that we forgot to say about the Romantics, that they thrive in loneliness. Solitude is what they like most. They like to be kept alone or left alone, if you like, where they, of course, they think and they wonder with their minds and they come up with poems. They think about the universe and contemplate on life and experiences. So solitude and loneliness are very big romantic markers. So I wandered lonely. And what is interesting, as we're going to find out, that the romantic poet can be in a company, but he or she feels lonely. He or she feels that he is alone. And it doesn't, when I say lonely, it doesn't mean that he is sad or no. It's a state of mind where he feels on his own. So it's not always sad to be lonely, according to the Romantics. No, you can choose to be lonely, to be on your own, unfettered, unmolested by people around you talking to you, taking you away with their engagements and issues and problems and everything. So I wandered lonely as a cloud. And then you have, so you're not only lonely, you're not only wandering, you feel like a cloud. What is so, where do you see clouds? High above in the sky. And what is interesting about clouds is that they move around, they move freely. So he is associating himself with an element of nature. Again, if anything, it's about the freedom that nature affords human beings like himself. So I wandered lonely as a cloud, and obviously in nature. And while wandering lonely as a cloud, I have seen this and that. And then comes the poem with all the elements of nature that he had. I'm not going to spoil it for you. I need you to read the poem on your own one more time. And I would like you to perhaps hear it recited. I would like you to go to the internet and write the title and ask for and Google um, a what? A video presentation of the poem where somebody is reciting it so that you can savor it, you can enjoy it, and you can feel it. Do that. And then after you have done that, I would like you to reflect on every single word. Look at the different stanzas, read them, see how romantic it is, break it down to its basic romantic components, if you like. And then read the chapter. And when we meet again, we're going to again focus more on other items and move on somewhere else. So until we do that, until I see you again, perhaps if you have questions, we can answer them. So if you guys have any questions, come to the mic. Okay, go ahead.
Doctor, I just have a question regarding quiz number 2. Do you have any idea when will it be and what chapters are included?
It should be, I mean, I'm sure Dr. Miss Fatma shared that with you. Did you miss that or something, Yanago? It should be on
Oh,
the course page. Did you check the course page on LMS?
yes, I've checked it recently and there was still nothing.
Right, let me check with her and I'll get back to you with all the details, inshallah.
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Welcome. Any other questions for now? Okay, we'll call it a day. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Bye bye.